Blood trickled down William Parker's temple as he rose from the bus floor. 4 young men had attacked the 75-year-old veteran. Now, they were all on the ground, moaning. The passengers stared in disbelief at what they'd just witnessed. Nobody knew the quiet old man in the faded military cap was once the most feared Special Forces commander in Afghanistan. The morning bus squealed to a stop, doors hissing open to welcome the rush hour crowd. Bodies pressed together in the humid air that smelled of coffee, damp coats, and a metallic scent of coming rain. Near the priority seating area stood 2 elderly men. The taller one, William Parker, wore a weathered military cap, his posture ramrod straight despite his 75 years. Beside him, George Miller, 67, gripped a worn canvas bag while leaning heavily on a cane, his arthritic knee making balance difficult on the moving bus. Across from them sat a young man in his 20s, legs sprawled wide, earbuds in, scrolling through his phone. The empty seat beside him was clearly marked for disabled passengers. George looked at the seat, then at his painful knee. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me, son. Would you mind if I sat down? My knee isn't what it used to be," George asked, his voice soft but dignified. The young man didn't look up. "Bus is packed, Grandpa. Should have gotten here earlier if he wanted a seat." He stretched his legs further across the empty space. A middle-aged woman nearby adjusted her glasses, noticing the interaction, then looked away. No one said a word. George didn't argue. He just stood there, swaying with the rhythm of the bus, clutching his bag tighter. Inside were his service medals, including a Purple Heart and old photographs of his unit from Vietnam. He had risen early for their annual memorial visit with William. The bus lurched suddenly around a corner. The overhead lights flickered as the vehicle dipped into a pothole. George braced himself with one hand on the pole, but his shoulder brushed against the young man's arm. "Don't touch me, old-timer," he barked. Heads turned, eyes peeked over phones, then quickly looked away again. George's face flushed, but he remained silent, backing up slightly. William watched, his weathered face impassive, blue eyes tracking everything. The young man smirked and leaned forward. "Seriously, y'all see this? Can't even ride the bus in peace without these old fossils invading your space." No one responded. A teenage girl stood across the aisle, her fingers hovering over a phone camera, but never pressing record. The young man reached out and tapped George's canvas bag. "What's in the bag, Grandpa?" "Something worth taking." He chuckled and flicked the strap. George shook his head. "Please don't," he said quietly. But the man didn't stop. He reached again, not to hurt but to taunt, grabbing the bottom of the bag and tilting it. The clasp broke, and the contents spilled out. Medals clattered to the floor, photographs scattered like leaves. A framed Purple Heart skidded under his seat. George gasped and bent down, steadying himself on his good knee, trying to collect his treasures. Then came the foot. Quick, deliberate. The young man stomped on a silver star, then kicked the photograph across the floor. "Playing soldier, were we? My tax dollars at work," he sneered. The impact wasn't loud, but the silence that followed was deafening. George's hands trembled as he reached for his medals. A teenager opened his mouth, then closed it again. An older woman covered her lips with her scarf. No one moved. The young man leaned back in his seat, proud of himself. "Lesson of the day," he said, everyone and no one. "Respect is earned, not given because you're old." And still no one spoke. But from the front of the bus, William slowly shifted his weight. He'd been standing the whole ride, one hand on the overhead rail, his stance slightly wider than necessary. He had seen everything, and his patience had just run out. The bus rattled over a pothole, the hum of the engine filling the silence. George continued gathering his scattered belongings, his arthritic fingers struggling with each medal. His Purple Heart lay beneath the young man's seat. When he reached for it, the man didn't move to help. Instead, he let out a loud sigh and grinned. "Oh, come on. You crawling now? It's just some cheap medal." George didn't answer. His hand stretched toward the medal, just under the man's boot. The young man lifted his foot, then deliberately brought it down. The frame cracked, glass splintering across the dirty floor. The crowd flinched. George looked up, their eyes meeting. The young man raised an eyebrow. "You done?" he asked casually. George said nothing. His hand trembled as he picked up the broken frame, carefully removing the Purple Heart from the shattered glass. Behind him, the bus lights flickered as William began to move. He didn't push anyone aside or rush. He simply walked with measured, silent steps past a mother clutching her child, past a college student gripping his bag tighter, past a woman with her phone frozen midair. The young man didn't see him approaching. He was too busy performing for the crowd. See, this is what happens when people forget they're not special anymore. Everyone thinks they deserve respect just 'cause they're old or claim they fought in some war. No one responded. A teenage boy lowered his phone and stared at the floor. George pushed himself upright with effort, steadying himself with the pole, his medals clutched in one hand, broken frame in the other. Then came a voice, deep, controlled, quiet as a razor sliding from its sheath. "Pick it up." The young man blinked confused, then turned. William Parker stood just 2 feet away. Closer now, close enough that the air around him seemed thinner. The worn military cap shadowed his eyes, but couldn't hide their intensity. "What?" the young man barked. William didn't blink. "The medal. Pick it up and apologize." A ripple went through the bus. One woman took a small step back. Someone began recording. The young man laughed nervously at first, then louder. "Oh man, you serious? Who are you supposed to be? His caretaker? His general?" He leaned back, now addressing the crowd. "We got ourselves a geriatric avenger here." William said nothing. He took one more step forward. Now the young man stood up, trying to reassert control, tilting his chin to maintain height advantage. "What's your problem, old man?" William's voice was like gravel dragged across stone. He was hurt. "You did it. Now fix it." There was no threat, no growl, just a statement as plain and grounded as gravity itself. The young man glanced around, but this time no one looked away. Not anymore. He rolled his shoulders, trying to puff up. "Back off. I'm warning you." William tilted his head slightly. "I've already warned you." The tension wasn't rising anymore. It had plateaued, heavy alive. Then, just when it felt like it might break, a sharp voice rang out from behind. "Yo, you need help with this guy?" It came from another young man several seats down, heavier built with a zipped-up jacket. Another troublemaker. William didn't turn. The first man smiled wider. "See? Now what?" William slowly scanned the second man, then returned his gaze to the first. George clutched his medals tighter. This wasn't just about disrespect anymore. It wasn't about medals or photographs. It was about a line being drawn, and William Parker had already stepped over it. The young man squared his shoulders and stepped toward William. "You got a problem, old-timer." "'Cause I don't back down for nobody, especially not someone who's been trying to play hero." William didn't answer. He just stood there, military cap casting a soft shadow over eyes that had seen things these men couldn't imagine. The bus swayed slightly as it drove over train tracks. The motion didn't disturb William's posture. He didn't reach for anything, didn't flinch. His arms hung relaxed at his sides, feet planted like they'd grown from the floor. Across the bus, phones were now recording. Not just one or two, but a dozen. No one spoke. They didn't laugh. They didn't smirk. They were watching for something they didn't quite understand yet. The second troublemaker started to approach from the left. "You want to get dropped, old man? 'Cause we don't care who you think you are." Still, William said nothing. The first young man waved a hand in William's face. "What? You deaf? You lost? This your first time outside the retirement home?" William didn't even blink. He slowly turned to check on George, who was still clutching his medals, face pale but eyes locked on his friend's back with quiet faith. William turned back, looked the young man dead in the eye. Then he spoke. "This is your last chance." The words weren't shouted or delivered with bravado, just stated like the bus was arriving, like rain was falling. Something inevitable. The young man snorted. "My last chance to what? Pick up a cheap medal for Grampy? Get out of here." He reached forward with an open palm and pushed William's chest. William stepped back half an inch. Not because he had to, but because he chose to let the pressure roll through him like wind past a tree. And that was when something shifted in the air. People didn't gasp. They didn't cheer. But the silence got heavier, the type of silence that falls before a thunderstorm. The young man pushed again, harder this time. You don't want to do this. Old man, trust me. William looked over his shoulder at George. Are you hurt? He asked. George nodded slightly. A little. William turned back to the young man, and something in his gaze changed. The softness vanished, replaced by something colder, more focused. Not anger, not rage, focus. He took one step forward. The young man immediately shoved again, but this time William caught the wrist midair. Not roughly, not violently, just enough to stop it. It was like the man's arm had suddenly hit steel. He blinked and tried to yank it back, but William's grip didn't tighten. It didn't need to. The man couldn't move. William tilted his head again. I warned you. The second troublemaker shifted uneasily. He looked toward a third man still seated halfway down the bus. That one hadn't moved yet, his eyes darting between the passengers' phones and William. The first young man finally yanked his arm free and stepped back. This guy's crazy. Just walk away, man. But William didn't move. He didn't posture. He didn't threaten. He just waited. The silence wrapped the bus like a cocoon. People were lowering their phones now, not out of boredom, but reverence. Someone whispered, "He hasn't even thrown a punch." The silence in the bus was electric. Every vibration from the road seemed amplified, as if the vehicle itself was holding its breath. The young man chuckled nervously. You all acting like he's something special. He turned to William. What now? You gonna give me some grandpa lecture about respect? William didn't move. The young man turned halfway toward the crowd, gesturing dramatically. I mean, come on. Look at him. What's it gonna do? Pull out his dentures and throw them at me? His voice rose, trying to recapture his dominance. You really think I'm gonna apologize and pick up that stupid medal just because some old guy asks nicely? Still, William said nothing. He simply adjusted his stance. Barely, but those watching noticed. A subtle shift in weight, feet a fraction wider apart, arms relaxed. That was all, yet unsettled the young man more than shouting ever could. Then, without warning, from the back of the bus, a fourth man stood up. No one had noticed him. Hoodie up, hands deep in his pockets, watching and waiting. He wasn't posturing like the others. He wasn't loud. He moved quickly, deliberately. As William turned to face his friend, the hooded man stepped forward. In his right hand, a short, thick baton, plastic but reinforced. He gripped it low and swung. The baton arced through the air and cracked against William's temple with a dull, heavy sound. William's knees buckled instantly. His shoulder slammed into the metal pole beside him. His body folded sideways and hit the bus floor hard, his military cap tumbling away. George cried out. Several passengers shouted. Someone dropped their phone. The bus erupted into chaos. The man with the baton stood over William, breathing heavily. His face wasn't cocky. It was blank cold, as if this was just a job. William didn't move. For the first time, the bus saw him still. One hand twitched, maybe a reflex. Then nothing. The attacker took a step back, scanning the crowd as if to say, see? That's all it takes. One passenger muttered, Did he just kill him? Another voice trembled, No, he's breathing. The first troublemaker blinked hard. Told you he was just pretending to be tough. His voice was shakier now. George dropped to his knees beside William, placing both hands on his friend's shoulder. Bill! Bill, look at me. Nothing. His voice cracked. Please. And then a breath. Shallow but clear. William's eyes opened. Not wide, just enough to show he was still in the fight. He blinked once, twice. His fingers flexed against the dirty bus floor. The attacker raised his baton again. Don't. George said sharply, rising to his feet. His voice wasn't strong, but fierce in its clarity. The man paused, then sneered. Stay out of it, old-timer. That's when William's left leg shifted. Barely, but enough. His elbow planted behind him. His other hand found the pole. He began to push himself up, slowly, deliberately, like a man who had fallen many times before and always got back up. The baton-wielding attacker hesitated. William was bleeding now, dark red streaking down his right temple. His jaw was clenched. His body swayed momentarily before straightening. He looked the man in the eyes, and something in that stare made the baton suddenly feel heavier. William didn't say a word, but everything about his body spoke clearly. Now it's my turn. He moved with efficiency, not speed. He stepped inside the baton's range. The attacker swung anyway. William leaned into the strike zone, his left hand catching the man's wrist mid-swing, stopping it cold. Then he twisted his hips, gripped the elbow, and turned. The baton clattered to the floor. The man tried to pull back, but William stepped forward, placed a palm on his chest, and pushed, not hard but precisely. The attacker stumbled backward into a metal pole. His head snapped back, and he dropped to one knee. Without pursuing, William turned toward the first troublemaker. Their eyes locked. William took one step forward. That was enough. The young man panicked and tried to run, but the bus was still moving. He threw a desperate punch that never landed. William sidestepped, hooked his forearm around the man's elbow, and applied pressure. A snap echoed through the bus. The young man cried out, clutching his arm. The second troublemaker charged, body low. William waited, then sidestepped. The man crashed into a seat, the wind knocked from his lungs. The third man hadn't even tried to join. The bus rumbled on as William stood still, one hand against the pole for balance. Blood trailed down his temple, but his eyes remained sharp. Passengers watched in awe. A young woman whispered, "He just took down 3 guys without breaking a sweat." Someone else murmured, "That wasn't random. That was trained." William turned and walked back to George. He knelt down, wincing slightly, and began gathering the scattered medals and photographs. His hands, weathered with age but steady as stone, carefully picked up each item as if it were priceless. Which, of course, it was. A passenger near the front peered at the medals, then at the insignia on William's fallen cap. His eyes widened. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "That's a Special Forces insignia, and those are combat medals." An older man leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "That's not just any veteran," he whispered. "That's William Parker. He was a Special Forces commander in Afghanistan. A living legend." The whispers spread through the bus. "Parker? The William Parker? The one who saved those hostages in '89? Didn't he receive the Distinguished Service Cross?" William didn't acknowledge the whispers. He simply helped George secure the medals in what remained of the bag. They worked in silence. 2 old warriors gathering the symbols of sacrifices most would never understand. The bus began to slow for the next stop. The troublemakers stayed down, no longer threatening, just watching William with newfound understanding in their eyes. As the doors opened, William helped George to his feet. Together, they walked toward the exit, George leaning slightly on his friend. No hero pose, no final words, just 2 veterans continuing their journey. A young boy tugged his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, "was that really a war hero?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, one of many we never notice until we need them." William and George stepped off the bus into the morning light. Behind them, passengers remained frozen, phones lowered, many eyes glistening with unexpected emotion. No one clapped. No one cheered. But everyone knew they had witnessed something important. Something about dignity, about respect earned through a lifetime, not demanded in a moment. The bus pulled away, but its passengers would carry this memory forever. The day they saw a true warrior, not because he fought, but because he chose when not to fight, until he had no choice. William and George walked in silence to the Veterans Memorial, where they would honor friends long gone. The medals would be placed carefully alongside photographs of young men who never grew old. Promises would be kept. Respects would be paid. And across the city, dozens of people would go home and tell this story. About an old man who stood up when everyone else sat down. About honor that doesn't fade with age. About respect that isn't asked for, but commanded by the quiet strength of those who have already proven themselves in ways most of us will never know. If you've ever witnessed a moment when someone stood up for what's right, when everyone else stayed silent. Share your story in the comments below. Our veterans deserve our respect not just on Memorial Days, but every day. Sometimes the quietest heroes are the ones who've seen the loudest battles.